Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to our session this afternoon on vocational competence and industry currency. It's nice to see so many of you in the room because this is an issue that, for whatever reason, is still challenging for us in the vet sector. Technology, you gotta love it. Okay, so why do we have to consider vocational competence and industry currency in our sector? And I guess the answer to that is really about the fact that, we can't all be a one-man band. We can't be everything to everyone. And we have a lot of people who work within our sector who in fact try to do this. The number of times that I have people talking to me where they say, well, look, I just read this last night and I'm going to teach it tomorrow. That's not what we want. And in fact, when the Productivity Commission looked into our sector and said, are the trainers and assessors in our sector in fact vocationally competent and industry current, the answer was that for the majority of us, that answer was no. So there's been a lot of focus by the regulators on vocational competence and industry currency in the past 12 to 18 months, and you would have seen that in the audit processes that you would have been through in that time. And there's good reason for it. So for a lot of organisations this has been quite challenging because in many instances there's a retrofit associated with that. We're having to go back and look at sometimes very big staff numbers to establish this. But as we move forward and as we have that ongoing focus on competence and currency, we shouldn't have such a challenge in the sector. So my plan, and we now have 45 minutes, I just don't want to be blinded by the light there. We now have 45 minutes to talk about this, is to deal with both of these things separately. So we're going to talk about vocational competence first, and then we'll talk about industry currency, and of course you're very welcome to ask questions. Okay, so we'll start with vocational competence. So this is really us credentialing ourselves. It's us saying, I am an expert in whatever I am teaching. And what is happening is, in fact, the regulators are looking at two things when they're looking at vocational competence and industry currency. We're looking at the kind of evidence that you use to establish the currency of your staff, and we're looking at the processes that you put in place to do that. So when we say someone is vocationally competent, what we're saying is that they hold the unit that they deliver or assess in, or they've established equivalence to it. And it's that establishing equivalence to it that is most challenging for people. So when we're talking about establishing equivalence, what we're looking for is the evidence that you use to make a decision. So what we're wanting you to do is to take a unit by unit approach and to look at what evidence someone can bring to you that would actually suggest to you that they're competent. So that means you have to have a good look at that unit of competency. You have to look at what kind of knowledge exists in that unit of competency. You have to have a look at the kinds of skills that that person is supposed to have. And really importantly, you have to look at how that is supposed to be applied. So for a lot of units of competency, there are some very generic statements in there about the kind of knowledge and skill that someone might need, and you have to look at the context in which it's applied. And obviously the importance of that can vary sector to sector. So we're looking for the application of knowledge and skills in the context in which that unit wants it, and we're looking for that individual, if you're establishing equivalence, to actually demonstrate that they have that. So if you think of your RPL processes in your organisation and what you go through there, where you have a look at the evidence that an individual might bring to you and you make a decision about whether they are competent or not, this is a very similar process. You're looking at evidence, and that could be some kind of formal training or informal training or work experience that a person has, and you're comparing that with what the requirements of the unit of competency are. And then we have to make a decision about whether, in fact, that does demonstrate that someone is competent or not. The thing with equivalency, though, is it stays within your organisation and someone doesn't get a statement of attainment or a qualification out of it. So it's a decision that only has relevance within the organisation within which it's made. So some people choose to, therefore, go through an RPL process because you do get the qualification at the end of it. And it is such a similar process that there's advantage to the person who's establishing equivalence in doing it that way. So the second part of this is that you've got the competence being verified by the RTO. So someone's going to bring you a whole lot of evidence and then someone within your organisation is going to verify it. So this is actually where the majority of the issues exist. Who is it that says, yes, that evidence does actually demonstrate that someone holds equivalent competence? So let's say it was something to do with someone who was a motor mechanic, okay? And that person is working for me. Well, my degree of knowledge about cars is it the right colour? Does it have a reversing camera? And what's the RAC's number? That's it. That's all I know about cars. So if I am looking at somebody's evidence to decide whether they would have some of those competencies, I'm the wrong person to look at it. I don't know what it is that I'm looking at. So we need someone who can actually fairly look at that evidence and say, yes, that really is an accurate reflection of what the knowledge and skills is and how they should be applied in the workplace. So you need to be, pretty careful about who you choose to actually make that decision of competence. For a lot of organisations, it means that they'll have industry people involved in that process, especially smaller organisations where there's a sole trainer and assessor within that organisation. The other thing about these processes is where they happen. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier the fact that for a lot of organisations this is causing some challenges because we've got a retrofit situation happening. But ideally these kinds of things would be happening within your recruitment processes. So when you're bringing someone on board, these are the kinds of things that could be checked and established within your recruitment processes so that it didn't become an issue later on. So that we didn't have 200, 300, 1,000 people to deal with all at once. So choosing the right person to actually do that, that person also needs to be able to, of course, read a unit of competence so that they know what they're comparing the evidence against. And that might mean that you have to put two people together to do that. So you might have someone who's an industry expert and you might have someone who's a trainer and assessor from within your organisation. So hopefully the similarities to an assessment process are actually ringing loud and clear in your ears. And from a regulator's point of view, we also want evidence of you having done that. Okay, when we register you as an RTO and we look at your compliance with the standards, we actually work within an evidence-based system. So you have to have evidence of your system of actually doing these things. Now that can look different in different organisations, but we need to be able to see the process that you have been through to establish the equivalence or the vocational competence of your staff. So lots of people will ask why we take a unit by unit approach to this, why don't we do this at a qualification level? And the answer is pretty simple. Would be nearly 10 years ago now, we started introducing this thing into our training package model, which we call flexibility. And of course what that meant is, in fact, in any given qualification you could actually have quite different skill sets, and some of the business qualifications are classic examples of that, where you're looking at the diploma and you have 9 elective units. So we could all hold a diploma of management and we could all have a completely different skill set. So we look at unit by unit. If you're teaching a unit, how have you established your competence in that? You hold it or you establish equivalence to it. Now, the other part of that, so first let me say that concept has been in the standards since we first had the AQTF. Okay, so that concept of vocational competence is not new. What is new is the regulator's focus on it, based on the outcomes of that Productivity Commission report. But, bless you, But what we do have that's new and that was introduced into the standards in 2010 was this idea of currency. So what we actually had in our sectors, we had a number of people who were qualified in our sector, but when we looked at had they actually been in the workplace and do they understand what the needs of industry are now, the answer to that was no. So we need to make sure that we are current. So I'm not quite sure why I've got an automobile theme going, but I do. So we don't want that. Now, does anybody recognise this young man here? It's Walt Disney. Apparently he was a truck driver at some stage. No, this is when he was doing volunteering service before he was Walt Disney movie maker. Okay, so currency. Currency is the one of these concepts, when we talk about vocational competence and currency, that just does not have one answer to it in terms of how you deal with it. Currency is different for different people, and the way you're going to approach how you establish currency for your staff is going to be different for the different people within your organisations. Because there's all kinds of different things that actually impact on the way that we establish currency. So for example, if you think about technological innovation, it happens faster and more frequently in some industry areas. If you think about changing legislation and regulatory requirements, again, it never happens in a blanket situation. It changes as it needs to change across the different industries. Changes to industry practice, they're not something there's a time frame set on. New and emerging skills and work practices are things that might affect your currency. And also for those people who have qualifications in areas where there is a higher degree of technical skill involved, then just your technical skill degradation and the rate at which your skills degrade will change and impact on the time frame that you need to think about in terms of currency for your organisation. So the reality is currency is a moving feast, and that makes it hard for you as organisations to deal with it, particularly in much bigger organisations, because you can't really have this blanket approach. So the question that we get asked is, how long and what type of approaches? And the reality is they're questions that you have to answer yourselves. So how long is currency? What does currency mean in my industry is a question that you in fact have to establish yourself. And that is the first thing that as the regulators we would ask about. What is currency in your industry? So if we're talking about the IT industry, for example, your currency period might be quite short. It could be 6 months. And in fact, if it was 6 months in the IT industry, you'd probably be a dinosaur. If we start to look at other industries, let's say maybe something like nursing or healthcare, then there are some concepts that sit within that industry that in fact haven't changed for 40,000 years. We've still got 206 bones in our body. It hasn't changed for 40,000 years. Our understanding of disease process, the treatments that you might have to treat disease has changed. The way we nurse has changed. So all of those things mean that there has to be some engagement with industry on your part as RTOs to figure out what in fact currency means for you. So as the regulator, we want you to be able to answer that question. We want you to be able to tell us how you've figured out what a currency period is in your industry. Now there are very, very few training packages where they actually tell you what currency is. So the construction training package is one where they do that, and they talk about you having been on a building site in an active role within the past 3 years. So that's pretty clear. In the RII training package that has just been released and is being reviewed because we can't implement it because of the currency issues in it, that's another training package that have actually said to us this is what currency means. So they have actually said in there, you have to have had this much experience and it has to have been within this time frame. And they've said that not only for the people who are the assessors, but they've also said it for the people who are the technical experts who might help you in the assessment process. So there are some training packages that are putting that information in there, but the majority of the training packages are silent on the issue, and they leave that up to you to determine. So again, as regulators have gone, oh gee, we don't really like that very much. So in the new standards, what you'll find is that in the part of Standard 1 that is about industry engagement, they've actually said you must use your engagement with industry to help establish the currency of your trainers and assessors. Okay, so we want you to engage with industry to do that. We want you to have established what knowledge and skills you actually have to keep up to date. Okay, so again, you're going to have a look at the units of competency that that person delivers and assesses, see what types of things they need to be keeping up to date with, and then you're going to have a plan for how you're going to do that. So potentially, you could have a plan for each individual within your organisation. You might be really lucky and you might have a group of individuals who all deliver and assess in the same area, in which case you might be able to have more of a blanket type approach for those people. But it is fundamentally looking at the currency of the individual and deciding what it is you're going to do for that person. Then once again, because we work in an evidence-based system, it's not enough to just have had that plan. We want to see that you've actually implemented that plan for currency. Okay, so we're looking at the evidence that they've done, that your staff have done, what it is you plan for them to do. And that's not unreasonable. I wouldn't have thought. Okay, so currency is the one where it is a little bit harder to figure out what to do. So, TAC, being a very user-friendly regulator, has actually put out a paper. They did this earlier this year on vocational competence and industry currency, which has quite a bit of information in there that could be helpful to you, and also points you to some other resources that are available nationally to think about vocational competence and currency. So that's downloadable off their website and it's in the publications area. So with both of these concepts, with vocational competence and with industry currency, you have to figure out what is going to work for you. And it really is not a one-size-fits-all. Now, in this publication, about halfway through, there is a table in here where they actually go through and talk about different types of approaches that might work with currency. A really, really common one that we get asked about all the time as auditors is professional memberships. So I'm a member of my industry's professional association, and I am. So what do I have to do to actually maintain my membership of that organisation? Well, I can tell you all I need to do is pay the $330 each year. Okay, so I don't have to prove that I've kept my skills up to date. I don't have to prove that I've engaged or even worked within the industry. All I have to do is pay the money. So in terms of evidence, and I can see a few people smiling around the room. You might be a member of the same association as me. The reality is, you know, for some people, being a member of your professional association is not going to be evidence of currency for you. Some professional organisations do actually require you to engage in development activities. So the question we would then ask is, are they related to what you deliver and assess? So the other association that I'm a member of, the Human Resource Association, I do have to do CPD every year, but I can do it in whatever I want. So as long as I engage in programs that are recognised by that organisation, then I'm going to get the points I need and I'm going to be able to maintain my membership. I could do a whole lot of things that have no relationship to what I deliver and assess in, and I would still maintain that. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that you actually need to look at what it is that is being offered to you as evidence of currency with a little bit of a critical eye. Okay, you have to ask the question, does this really relate? Does this really give this person the opportunity to maintain the currency of their skills or their knowledge? And, you know, unfortunately for some of those things, the answer is going to be no. It's going to be no. The other very common one that I want to address is when trainers and assessors spend time in the workplace, doing workplace training and assessment. So again, you know, that varies very much depending upon what it is you do when you go into the workplace. So for example, you know, I do a little bit of work with Woodside. When I go to their site, well, probably from that main door out there to this room is about from the gate to the room that I use. And then I come into a room like this. I might as well be standing here when I'm on their work site because I'm not actually engaged with the work that they do. So for me, if I was trying to use that as evidence of currency, it wouldn't work. If I was actually on the floor with them, watching them do their work, talking to them on you know, that day-to-day basis, watching what was happening, that would be different. Then certainly maybe I could use that as evidence of currency.
Would that be valid because they're not practicing it?
Well, it would depend what I was trying to. If I was looking at developing my own technical skill, as in let's say I was a machinist of some kind and I needed to still be able to machine, the answer would be no. If I wanted to look at current work practices, the answer would be yes. Tricky. And so this is why, you know, you have to look at this very, very carefully. And you do need to look at it with a critical eye. So there's some information in here that is helpful for you, gives a few examples, points you to some other publications that might be useful for you. And it also points to some research that was done by NCVER around, well, they called it professional obsolescence. It's just a fancy word for currency. Around professional obsolescence. And what they did was they came up with a set of principles that organisations could use, and if they applied, would actually be really useful. So for example, you know, having a strategic approach to maintaining the currency of your staff. So that as you've really thought about how this is going to work across your organisation, and there is a clear and defined strategy in place to enable you to do that. So there's a whole lot of points that sit there out of that research that you can have a look at. They've looked across a whole range of different industry areas, and it's really quite informative. So while you're on the beach over your summer holidays, maybe this is what you're going to be reading instead of that trashy novel that you had tucked in your bag already. So figuring out what it is that works for you is you know, an important activity for you and your organisations. So I've already mentioned that the new standards actually introduce this requirement for you to engage with industry to actually contribute to the currency of trainers and assessors. And we'll just delve into these new standards because they do actually define in here what current industry skills are. So when you're thinking about these new standards, again, it's important to understand that the glossary, the definitions that are in here are auditable. Right, so when we look at currency, it talks about the knowledge, skills and experience required by the vet trainers and assessors and those who provide training and assessment under supervision to ensure that their training and assessment is based on current industry practice and meets the needs of industries. And then it goes through and it lists a number of things that you could in fact do. So it says current industry skills could be informed by consultations with industry that include but are not limited to having knowledge of and or experience of the latest techniques and processes, possessing high-level product knowledge, possessing, not processing. I should have brought my glasses. Understanding and knowledge of legislation relevant to the industry and to the employment and workplace, being customer or client oriented, possessing formal industry and training qualifications, and training content that reflects current industry practice. So they're saying any of those things, you could use your engagement with industry to in fact assure any of those things. And that all of those things potentially could contribute to the currency of your staff and your training and assessment that you offer. Okay, so there's a little bit more help in this set of standards than we've had in our last ones. Our last ones just said make sure they're current. So there's more information there for you. And of course, each of the regulators is also putting out a user's guide for those standards. The ASQA user's guide is available on their website now. And tax user's guide should be out within the next week and a half. So there will also be information there that could be helpful to you as RTOs. Is it Friday today?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not the 13th.
So, we now have about 15 minutes where we can answer any of your questions that you might have about, or we can try and answer, any of your questions that you might have about vocational competence or industry currency. So I'll open the floor to you. Yes, I will. Yes.
I have a question around the qualifications a trainer holds
Yes.
and to what level they need to hold to what they're training. So,
Mhm.
for example, if they're training, a certificate for a business, do they need to hold that certificate for a business?
So the question is, if you are training, for example, a certificate for in business, does the trainer assessor need to hold a certificate for in business? Right. So we would look at the units that that person is delivering. So we would look at it as a unit by unit approach. So if they were delivering 8 units, well, with that Cert 4 would probably have about 12 or 13 units in it. So we would look at those 12 or 13 units and we'd look to see that they hold those units or that they have established equivalents to those units. Yep.
Without doing the TAE in Cert 4 TAE,
Yep.
how else could you demonstrate equivalence for the assessing component?
Well, for example, you might have been involved in workplace assessment within your organisation. So I can use myself as an example there. So the workplace, the questions. It's Friday, you have to forgive me. So the question was, without holding the assessor units from the TAE, how could you establish equivalence to those assessor units? So we could have had experience in the workplace. So for example, before that qualification came out, I worked in a workplace where I was required to conduct technical assessment, vocational assessment in the workplace. So I would have been able to use, and in fact did, use that experience that I had to go towards, I chose to do RPL. I'd also had some formal qualifications in education and training, so I was able to use some of that knowledge and skill to establish equivalence to the units in the Certificate 4. So in essence, you would do exactly the same for the TAE qualification as you would with any other at the moment, because the new standards changing the rules around that. However, at the moment, you could still establish equivalence, and it would be a matter of looking at what workplace experience you've had that aligned with the requirements of the unit and what other training or assessment you might have done that aligned with the unit.
In terms of industry currency,
Yeah.
you're talking about trainers assessors going into industry or trying to demonstrate that process. Often I hear that industry representatives are asked to come into the organisation and
Yep.
use their group approach of getting the motor mechanics
Yep.
together and say, oh, there's a rep coming and
Yep.
introducing a new product.
Yep.
Would that again be, from what you described, as part of the process, depending on what competence you would like to demonstrate?
Yes. So yeah, I remembered this time. So the question was, if we're establishing currency for our trainers and assessors, that often we hear of not the trainers and assessors going out to industry, but industry coming into the RTO. So we have one industry person coming in, addressing the needs of a whole lot of trainers and assessors within the RTO. And it could be something like there's a new product or a new piece of equipment that's being used and they're demonstrating that. So could that be used as part of the evidence that would go towards currency? Yes, if product knowledge was something that was required from the unit of competency, absolutely you could. Yes.
So the scenario is a Masters of Business
Yeah.
then comes into RTO and would like to train, but there's no recognition across there.
No, there's not. So the question is, someone with a Masters of Business,
Master's degree of business.
yeah, comes in to deliver in the business area. And that was the situation that I had. You know, like I had Masters in education and I was looking at the TAE. Now the reality is that there could be lots that is relevant from that qualification through to the knowledge that's required in the unit, and there might be none. When we look at the higher level qualifications, I think probably the best way to look at it is not that it's higher, but that it's a different qualification. And we're looking at establishing what the similarities are between that different qualification and the units that you're trying to establish equivalence to.
So sorry, do I understand correctly that you said we are looking at, as in you or the TAC are looking at the equivalency, or they are not?
Absolutely we are, yes. Because it's a requirement of the regulatory standard. So the question was, is the regulator looking at equivalency? And yes, we are. We're looking at it because it's a requirement of the standard that each RTO establishes the vocational competence of their staff. And if you're using an equivalence process to do that, then we will look at that process, yes.
I also have a question along that thing. In our RTO, so they're all electricians post-trade, and it's a very specialised area, which is this area. And as we now have in every training package an environmental unit,
Yes?
I have found it actually very challenging in overcoming that, because a lot of that environmental stuff is attached to the OHS things, and like our trainers, they are very well equipped with all the OHS, but the environmental things, it's very difficult sourcing an equivalent unit, because no one actually delivers that in a long-standing unit. What strategies could be used, you know, of overcoming that?
So the question is around the introduction of the environmental units into the training packages, and Eva has got trainers and assessors who are post-trade electricians, so they're working in a very specialised area, and when it comes to the environmental unit, then there's not really an equivalent. So we're not going to be able to use another qualification to establish equivalence. My suggestion would be that in fact you would be using workplace experience to establish equivalence. Yes.
What I had in my mind.
Yes.
I just wanted to have a
Yeah.
confirmation.
So sometimes it's things that people have done in the workplace. It might even be things that they have done in their, their private life, in their hobbies. So for example, it might be that you're looking at a generic business unit which is about running meetings. And you've been the president of your local sport club and you run meetings all the time. It's not a work-based situation, but it's something that you have substantial experience in. So as long as what you've done in the workplace or what you've done outside of the workplace, whatever that experience is, actually aligns to the requirements of the unit, then we can use that to establish equivalence. Any other questions?
So it sounds like there's quite a lot of flexibility with what we can use then, or what we can use with the clients, for example, or people that we've got. That doesn't have to be specifically related to, it could be external, like you said, it could be their hobbies, it could be, say, in church or something, and they're doing business, but they're responsible for organising and running meetings and getting the minutes organised, and sort of all that sort of stuff can be included. Is that right?
Yes, so the question is that it seems like there's a lot of flexibility around what you could actually include and use as evidence of vocational competence and of currency as well. And yeah, absolutely, the answer is yes. So we've got to make sure that whatever it is you're offering does align to what the requirement of the unit is, and that you can establish that you have made that decision based on evidence.
If I may support that, one of the areas that can be supporting that is if you're a treasurer of an organisation, that covers a multitude of aspects, because you still have to comply with regulations, you still have to comply with the Commerce Associations Act or Company Act, and you still have to undertake the banking process. So in those three areas, that can support quite a bit.
So what Graham was saying is that in the that if you're, for example, the treasurer of an organisation, that there's a lot of things that in fact line up for a lot of units in that, you know, you have to comply with legislation and regulation and Financial Act and all kinds of things that could actually be aligned to what sits in some of the units of competence. And it really is about that. It's about taking a broad look at what you do and what you have done and seeing how those things line up. And hopefully they will. And if they don't, you always have an assessment process sitting there in the background that you could use. Okay, any other questions? Okay. We will then, so thank you.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.